Welcome, everybody. This is the ABA Engineering Academy series of engineering webinars. Each month, we present these webinars covering various technical topics for both broadcast and multimedia engineers. I'm Larry Wilkins with the ABA here in Birmingham, Alabama, and our co-host, John George, who I'm not really sure. Are you on the road today or are you at home, John?
No, I'm actually at home in South Carolina today.
Oh, that's wonderful. I want to remind you that at the end of our program, John is going to talk a little bit about our program coming up for the next month. So make sure when we get through the program that you hang around and will fill us up on all what's going on there. These webinars are actually part of the ABA Engineering Academy and are sort of work together with the Alabama Broadcasters Association, along with the Georgia and the South Carolina broadcasters as well. It's underwritten by Bond Broadcast Services, and he is a full service broadcast service. He has sales, anything from microphones all the way to antennas, plus he has a service department. So if you need help in designing or installing new facilities or repairs, make sure that you check them out. www.bond broadcast, it's BOHN broadcast.com. And we appreciate all of his work and his sponsorship. Our program today, we want to talk about audio production. And with the change of audio production from analog, back when we used to have the old two-track machines and the splicing block. Most of you on the call remember splicing blocks and the razor blades. I've always said there's probably more DNA on that splicing block in a radio station than there was anywhere else because of people editing tape. When we moved over to digital and we went to computerized and used a digital audio workstation, that changed a whole lot. And there's a lot of great features that you can have using a DAW, but there's one problem. If you don't really understand those features and how actually to use a DAW properly, your production can actually go down instead of going up. And we've seen this happen at quite a few radio stations. So our program today is actually going to talk about that. And I sort of borrowed one of our guests, a topic that he did over at Oxford University. It's what comes out of the speaker that counts. And that rings true whether or not you're recording music for a record or you're producing a spot for the local Chevrolet dealer at your radio stations. What comes out of the speaker that really counts. We have three very talented, and I'll underline very talented guests with us today. We have Frank Fody, who is with Telos Alliance. They are the designers and manufacturers of the Omnia processor. We also have with us Al Mason, who is with Al Mason Productions up in Nashville, Tennessee. He has a voiceover studio. And then our very special guest coming all the way from London, and I hope you like that picture, Andrew. I found that on the website.
I look very intense there.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you were doing. This is Andrew Scheps. He's a Grammy award-winning mix engineer. And if you don't know of Andrew, some of the names of the artists, and I won't read them all because we'll be here for the whole hour naming them all, but people like Metallica, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Jay-Z. He also was on tour with Michael Jackson for a while. So he's got a lot of experience. So with that, we want to welcome, see if I can get off of these slides here and switch over to just y'all. There you go. Now let's switch over to Andrew and welcome to our webinar today.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Okay, we look forward to it. Before we actually jump right into the technical part, I'd like maybe to have Frank and Andrew talk a little bit about digital audio. I think that's the prime thing that most people need to understand, even before they start doing any recording or editing, is actually how A to D and D to A works. Now, we can't go into our presentation, but just sort of talk about what the most important thing is that production people need to understand about it. Frank, you start.
Sure. I guess to keep it simple, and for the rest of our program today with Andrew and Al, think of it like when an artist goes to create a painting, you start with a fresh canvas. Having a full understanding of the operation of your A to D and D to A converters is very important here. Different than in analog, in the digital world, we have something called 0 dBFS, meaning full scale. And unlike in analog, we don't have anything that's plus 2 dB full scale. Once you hit full scale, that's it. You can try to go beyond it, you're going to run into digital clipping, and that's not a friendly thing, because digital clipping is all the distortion characteristics of analog, along with one additional nasty problem, and that's aliasing distortion. So the best thing to help people understand is that that I try to explain to people is that understand that you want to keep an operating level that's somewhere below 0 dBFS. And when you think about, to make an analogy to the analog world, when you think about what we call 0 VU, which is usually about +4 dBu, that's somewhere about 20 to 24 dB below the clipping point of your system, like an audio console, some audio device, or what have you, because that's below where the power supply rails are going to give up and cause distortion. It's the same thing here, except in the nomenclature on usually a lot of bar graphs, we don't really, a lot of equipment, you don't see a 0 other than for full scale. So if you keep your average operating level somewhere 20, 24 dB below full scale, you should be good. The last thing I'll say is you want to make sure that everything is in what I call convergence, meaning you don't want to have any added gain from, let's say, the output of the audio console, so that 0 dBFS is going to be the exact same level as 0 dBFS if you're going into some outboard processing or some recording device or some converter to get it back to analog or something to that effect. Larry, like you say, without taking up the entire hour, I think I'll stop there, or we can hear from Al or Andrew, if they have any other thoughts on this part of the topic.
Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add is that, as Frank mentioned, analog gear is much more forgiving as you get to the maximum levels. So whenever you're doing a conversion, either from analog to digital or digital to analog, that level is really, really important, and you need to have that headroom. But the great thing about digital, especially in modern workstations, is while you're working digitally, you can actually be a little looser with it while you're working, while you're building up whatever it is you're building, because you can actually adjust the gain structure at any point. So you don't permanently ruin things in digital unless you record them or unless you put them through a D to A. So it's a lot more forgiving once it's in there, but you've got to be really careful coming in and out.
One other quick thing I want to mention. I realize we're probably going to talk about a lot of linear processes here, but Larry, you've asked me many times about like streaming audio. Whenever a codec is involved, you always want to leave a little bit extra headroom, about maybe 3 dB, because in the use of a lot of codecs, on the decode side, if the decoder is not, let's say, referenced to the encoder, you can get overshoots. So that's why, especially after processing's been applied, if you're sitting up near 0 dBFS, you got to be careful, because if you've got a decoder that's not referenced, you can push that into digital clipping or some kind of nasties down the road, and then you're going to wonder what happened. So if you're going to have a codec involved, I'd say add maybe 3 dB of added headroom for this purpose. Thank you.
Yeah, Al, do you when you're doing your voiceovers and all, do you leave the headroom because a lot of it's going to be streamed?
Yes, and that was probably over the course of the past 20 years in switching over from analog to digital. That's been like the toughest thing to wrap my mind, or at least to get my habits geared toward, because back in in the early days, the objective was to cover up tape hiss, but you don't have tape hiss to cover up anymore. So finally, I came to accept that you can record at a lower level, mix at a lower level, and it's all nice and clean. You can always boost it up if you need to, But the main priority is to avoid getting it nasty to start with. As you distort it, in the recording process, then you're stuck with that.
And there's a bit of a myth about that if you don't record loud, you're not using all your bits. And that's just not true. If you put a bit scope on anything, you've got to get really quiet before you turn any of those bits off.
Oh, yeah. And lose resolution.
Yeah.
Yeah, I heard somebody say one day that the problem was when you hit in digital, since you're using binary to represent what the level of the audio is, when you hit 0 dBFS, that means all the bits, whether it's 16 bits or 24 bits or whatever it happens to be, all the bits were ones. And you can't, and there's not anymore, and you can't run down to Radio Shack and get a new bag of bits. I mean,
No,
they're gone.
With modern DAWs, though, internally they're all working in what's called floating point. So you don't actually ever run out. You can look as though you're clipping, but as long as you take care of it before it comes out through a D to A or gets recorded or gets processed by something that's lossy, you can actually recover where you were overshooting before you do the D to A conversion. I mean, obviously it's best to never go there, but if you do while you're working on something, as long as you haven't recorded it or broadcast it, you can still recover all those peaks.
And here's another thing. If you do, for whatever reason, you've got something that's done and you love it, and something got really broken in the form of like heavy clipping, there are algorithms out there in the form of a declipper that can fix it. This is an area that I've done a lot of work in, and we'll have coming out some, let's say, tools to help in this regard, where if it unfortunately got busted, it can be fixed. And by the way, if aliasing distortion was introduced, the declip process will pull the aliasing distortion out.
Great. One thing I wanted to talk about today, and especially with Andrew, the little phrase that you sort of use, and you mentioned on one of your YouTube videos that it's something you didn't come up with, but you use it a lot. It's what comes out of the speaker that counts. Take a minute or two and talk about how important it is to have set your monitoring system up correctly in a room, because if you don't have a good monitoring system, then the end results, you're not going to know what they sound like.
Yeah, I mean, the way I use that phrase is more of a way to keep in mind that it doesn't matter what tools you use to do something. It doesn't matter how it got done. It doesn't matter if you're in a good mood or a bad mood or whether you like it or not. Somebody listens to it and you're not in the room with them. And so the only thing that matters to them is what they hear. So this is a way to kind of take ownership of your own creative work and to understand that once it goes out into the world, you can't also tell them, yeah, but I was in a hurry. It doesn't matter. But in terms of the monitoring, what the most important thing about any monitoring setup is that you understand it and you understand how it will translate out into other monitoring systems. So in some way, you can make the argument that it absolutely doesn't matter what you listen on, as long as it's something that you know. But the only way to test that is to work in your monitoring environment, go listen somewhere else. Like when you're working on records, quite often you listen in the car or you listen on computer speakers or just somewhere else. And if you hear problems, you need to be able to go back to your original monitoring environment and identify those problems and fix them there, not rely on always referencing somewhere else to hear where your problems are. You've got to make sure wherever you're creating your product, you can hear everything about it that needs to be taken care of before it goes out into the world.
So the main thing is to learn your speaker and your room and
Absolutely.
understand.
And not to think that you can't do something because you're limited in your monitoring. I do a huge amount of work on these Sony headphones that cost $200 at Amazon. And I've been using them for 20 years. And there are quite a few records I've mixed when I've been traveling that were done exclusively on those headphones. And it's just a matter of knowing them.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. How does that, working from a speaker to a headphone, is that still a good way to mix? with
It's
headphones?
I don't know that I would say that anything is necessarily good or bad, to be honest. I mean, obviously, making records is different to broadcast because broadcast has many more standards, and you also have much shorter things that have to work one right after another when you're talking about advertisements and spots and things like that. Whereas with the records, you have to be in the ballpark, but it's fine if you sound totally different from another record. So you don't have quite as much leeway as I have possibly sonically, but there's no real difference. I mean, headphones, the only thing about headphones that you don't get that you get with speakers is crosstalk. So if you have something just on the left side, that can be uncomfortable in headphones, but not really be a problem on speakers. But in terms of the actual product, it's just another way to listen. It's a pair of speakers hanging on the side of your head.
And, Larry, to further support what Andrew's saying, consider how, since most of us are broadcast based, when he talks about the monitoring system and knowing that, it's the same thing of like having that point of reference in the radio station to know the sound of your radio station, where, you want to make sure the station sounds great on a certain set of monitors, yet how does it sound in the car? How does it sound in the GM's car and things of that nature? So Andrew, there's some of these things that do kind of complement one another with regard to what we're talking about.
We've always told people that when you're adjusting a processor at a radio station, the one place you don't want to listen to see how it sounds is the general manager's car. He usually has the worst radio. He may have the most expensive car, but he's got it so maladjusted that that's a bad place to listen to.
I think it's the same thing. You want to have a reference, a known reference, and someone who knows that reference and then knows what to do. And when you have that, that's when you're able to create killer sound. And it's the same with regard to production. When I worked in radio, I had a chance to work with some really great broadcast production guys. And I got to tell you, they knew their monitoring system, speakers and headphones, inside and out. And the end result was top notch all the time.
Al, do you use it seemed like I remember back in the past when we were working together, didn't you used to have you had some good speakers, but you also had a little mono speaker?
Yeah, somewhere along the way, I lost a little mono speaker, but I do discipline myself to listen quietly. I try to, you in the mix, you get all caught up in, you crank it up and you're twisting knobs here and there and getting mixing in every little sound just right, but then you want to go back and listen at a normal at a level that the average listener is going to be listening at, and you'll hear a lot of things might disappear or get covered up. So
yeah, your ear and your brain mechanism can play tricks on you if you mix at a very high level. Yeah,
Larry, the simple explanation for what they're talking about is you're playing off the Fletcher-Munson curve, because if you look at the Fletcher-Munson curve, as you bring the levels up, things get closer. I don't say they get flat, but at the lower levels, and when you're paying attention, you're actually you're leaning on the sensitivity of your eardrums, and you end up hearing a lot more quite easily. That's a great point, Al.
Yeah. It sure is. Andrew, I know one thing that we wanted to talk about in your line of work, you working with obviously multi-tracks. I mean, 60, 70, maybe 100 tracks. In a radio station, typically, if you're using multi-track, you're using not near that many, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 at the most if you've got a lot of stuff to add in there. But when you begin a session, especially if you're going to track it, record, walk through sort of how you set that up to actually begin the recording, to make sure that, I know the old adage is get it right at the source. So talk about that a little bit.
Well, I mean, obviously, microphone choice is very important if you're recording voice. I mean, I'm on an SM7 today, and I'm sure there are 5,000 SM7s in the rooms of people watching this because it's such a great and standard microphone. But having a couple of choices, because there will be a day where somebody just sounds weird on an SM7 and you want to have something else to try, something else that's different. So I'd say having a couple of choices, one dynamic, one condenser sort of thing for microphones, but you can't undo bad sounding things later. You can fix stuff to a point, but if somebody is in a room and the room is very echoey and that echo is getting into the microphone, it's going to be almost impossible to dry that out later. There are tools that can do it. And if you're really stuck with the way a source sounds, as I mean, Frank's talking about declipping, there are de-reverbs, there are de-delay plugins, but they don't work that well and things start to sound processed. So getting it right at the source is as much about the acoustic space you're recording something in as it is about the person making the noise and the microphone you're using to record it. And it is really important.
When you're setting it up, and I know you do mostly mixing, but you've also done some tracking too, I'm sure. When you transfer over, do you have a particular template, or do you suggest people to use a template when you start to do the mixing?
I rely on my template, absolutely. And the reason is not because I make everything sound the same. It's because while you're doing the repetitive tasks of setting up the same things that you use on every single mix, you're first of all not listening. And second of all, you're taking energy away from you, like you're your own energy vampire. When you're done with all the repetitive stuff, you're not in the mood to actually work on something creatively because you've just had to do this point click stuff that you've done a million times. So what the template does for me is it has more than I'll ever need on a mix, but it's all there, it's named, it's easy to get to, and I know exactly where to go based on what I'm hearing and what I want something to sound like. So I believe that templates for mixing are really, really important.
The reason I bring that up, and Al, you can comment on this, you and I talked about this the other day, was in a radio station, you may have 2, 3, or 4 different, or maybe 5 different people that do production. Like they're on the air from a certain time, and then when they get off the air, they'll go into the production room and cut a commercial for the Chevrolet dealer or whatever it happens to be. And in order to save time, my thinking initially was, why don't you go in and set up a template for each one of the people that are going to do production, so they'll all be the same. All they have to do is go in and click on, you can name them like Joe 60 second or Joe 30 seconds, and you click on it and all the tracks are already there where the voice track goes in, the background music and stuff that way. Al, what is you had another thought about doing something different instead of making one for each individual announcer?
Well, I work with Pro Tools, so I have a setup very much like Andrew's talking about, where you've pretty much got the board already set up when you pop open the template. You don't have to go in and plug it and set up all your plugins, tweak them. They're already set, levels, inputs, outputs, all that. But I use one size fits all, and then make individual tweaks if I have to different voices or whatever. And in the radio station, you would probably be more on the right track to where you're going to have multiple producers to have a different template for each one. You would have to kind of learn their idiosyncrasies and learn how to maybe work around those in the template so that they can push, plug and go. I still am old school enough, and then if you translate this into what's going on in radio these days, I think it's even more important that you have a production point person, that there's somebody on one of those 4 or 5, or you're being real generous these days. That's a big operation in today's radio, 5. But if you've got that many people who do production, you probably got one of them who's really good at it, and the others who may dabble in it. And so I'm for having one go-to point person for production. Everybody else records their voiceover, and that person finishes everything out. It's kind of like, it may be a little bit of a sting to start with to the morning guy who's always done all of his own spots, when suddenly he's just doing voice tracks. But you can sell that up. That's kind of like when you walk into a big LA studio and all you do is lay down your voice and exit the booth and never touch anything. And what I do here, really, I don't have a VO production studio. I'm a post-production guy. I work with voice talents all over the country and turn their voice mostly into imaging for radio stations, and then turn around a finished out turnkey product. So I'm talking about having somebody like a little microcosm of that in your station, somebody who's collecting the voices and turning out the production, and who's responsible for it. Your salespeople have one person to go to. They're not spending their sales time chasing down people to get stuff recorded and then finding somebody to produce it, etc.
And that's, I guess, Andrew, that's sort of what you do in mixing. You get somebody else does the tracking of a band or an artist, and they send you the tracks, and you import them into your Pro Tools, and then mix from there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Al, while we've got you up on the screen, one of the things I read the other day, and I'd love to have you comment, and Frank and Andrew as well, but it seems over the years, it's sort of changed in that clients used to want a disc jockey voice on their commercials. We used to call them Joe Radio, that had that grumbly voice and the fast talking and stuff. But it appears from what I've been reading is that things have sort of changed, where now, especially the agencies and clients that understand this type stuff, are actually going to more of a conversational type spot. Do you see that in your work there in Nashville?
Oh yeah, well, and that's been going on. That was happening in Montgomery, and we were working. We were sort of the local Montgomery recording studio in our radio station that you and I worked at together for a period of time there, working with all the ad agencies in town. And even back then, this is in the 90s, you could lay down a voice track and they would go, oh yeah, that's great, but it's got too much radio in it. Give it to me a little less radio. Nowadays, they're using actors and untrained real people off the streets a lot more. The agencies are than radio voices.
Yeah, that seems like the way it's going now. And one of the things in the article I read the other day, and I had never thought about this, said when a client wants a 60-second commercial or a 30-second commercial, they have the misunderstanding that they have the whole 60 seconds with the audience, but that's not true. You only got like the first 5 seconds or 7 seconds. If you don't grab the attention of the listener in that first 5 or 7 seconds, you've lost them, because most people listening to the radio are multitasking anyway.
Sure. Yeah, you've only got as much time as you can keep their attention. So the rest would be wasted.
And most people may be 5 seconds or less, but
yeah.
So you really need to ground it. One other thing while you're on there and we talk about it is the selection of background music. I find that that's really a sore subject on a lot of people. Sometimes a spot or a commercial actually sounds better and doesn't even need any background music. Or if it does, a lot of people sometimes pick a instrumental song that's too busy, and it interferes with what the client's trying to get across.
Yeah. Well, I've always been of my motto has always been to produce anything I do needs to work with the voice. So background music is, you're trying to match that to the read or the tone of the voice. And nowadays you got to be, it's a lot more, you don't just grab an album out of the bin and put that behind your commercial. You have services you have to subscribe to, and so it's a lot easier to find or to narrow down your music choices just by what you can enter in your search criteria. But and there are different schools of thought, and usually it comes from a program director who's just adamant that there won't be any cold voice commercials on his station because he thinks that beat's got to be going all the time. I'm hearing less and less of that, just strictness these days. I hear a lot of voice only spots that work, that get the job done, that get the message across. And that's really what it boils down to: connecting with the listener and, connecting with a message that can be, translated to them in a very short amount of time, and that, let them do the work to actually, go take advantage of it.
Right. Let's talk, Andrew, a little bit about the actual mixing, because I know that's what you do for a living. And when you start to mix, radio stations in the past really didn't get involved in a whole lot of mixing multi-track, especially in the analog days. If you had background music and you had maybe some effects that you needed to put on a certain part of the commercial, you almost had to be an octopus, trying to organize everything in the analog world on the console and the starting the track that's got the music and all that. But now you can actually do it in multi-track form, where you lay the voice track down on one track, the background music on another track, the effects, and in the way that you mix music for people with all the multi-tracks, you divide them all up into different tracks, and then when you start to mix, do you do a dry mix before you do anything else as far as EQ and effects and stuff like that?
No, it all kind of happens at once. I mean, and that's the thing about having the template, is that there would be some audio processing, like whatever your master bus processing is, the limiter you like to use and things like that would be part of the template. So, but it feels like doing what you're calling a dry mix, because that's the stuff I always start with. So I make my consoles sound like something that I like, instead of saying I'm going to start from nothing, because that's the point of having the template, is that work is done. But you have to be smart enough to remember to double check that everything that's in your template is actually helping on a particular mix. So I will very often strip some things back out that I've used 80% of the time in the 6 months leading up to that. So you do have to be very aware of what is in your template and how it affects things, because sometimes you'll be chasing your tail, especially with vocals. And so voiceover is the same sort of thing, trying to get the right emotion out of it. And it can turn out that some compression that's in your template that works almost every single time is actually the thing that's messing with the voice. And just to go back to the thing about the background music, music is ridiculously powerful in terms of creating emotion in humans. And it can be unbelievably distracting. And if you're going to be choosing background music, it may sound silly when you're doing a 30-second spot for a candy store or something, but you've got to treat it like you're scoring a film, because you are creating the emotion that the voice that has to support whatever the message is that's going on in that spot. Not like, oh, this is high energy and that'll be enough. Something that's high energy takes a lot of bandwidth in your brain to actually listen to. And that may be something that will be distracting and not supporting the high energy that you want to get out of that spot.
Larry, something that I think bookends nicely with what these guys were talking about, to help spots sound good on the radio. And yes, I'm sitting nearby a train, if you hear it coming by in the background. We had something occur about 20 years ago here in Cleveland. There was a recording studio by the name of Commercial Recording. They did primarily, broadcast and television commercials. And they had a client that really wanted their spots to pop on the radio. So they asked if they could borrow one of our broadcast audio processors so they could mix, so that their mixing was being done as if it was on the radio. And they found that by working the mix based on what the broadcast processing was going to do, they ended up doing some things much differently than they normally would. And boy, their spots really popped on the radio. And so that's something that I would say that if somebody has, like, sitting in a rack somewhere not being used, some older audio, multi-band audio processor, you might consider having that in the monitor so that you can get a rough idea of what it's going to be like when it goes on the air, because it will affect it. A quick for instance on that, a couple of years ago, I was visiting with a friend of mine, Frank Filippetti, who did a lot of production with Carly Simon. And Frank was telling me, this is back in the 80s, how he thought that the two of us crossed paths, but we didn't know we crossed paths. And he was doing a mix for Carly Simon. It was one of her hit records. And Carly kept telling him, no, something doesn't sound right. Something doesn't sound right. And Frank's trying all this different stuff. And Frank, like Andrew, many Grammy Awards. So finally, Carly says, come with me. And she took him out and made him listen to some music in her car. And she said, I want my record to sound like that. and she pointed at the radio, and it just so happened to be Z100, which was where I was chief engineer at the time. And she said, I want the effect to be like that. So it kind of supports. He told me, he said he went and he changed things a bit with the idea of how was it going to react once it got on the radio. And you know, that's another item that, you know, or a variable that plays into all this, be it music or making commercials.
Sure. We've got a couple of questions here. We'll stop and see if we can answer those. One was for you, Andrew. Somebody wanted to know the difference between microphones and processing for voice for broadcast and for those being used for live events. Is there a difference between the two?
Well, I mean, live events, you're obviously dealing with sound reinforcement, so your pickup pattern has to be a little bit tighter, and a lot of the cooler new live mics actually have proximity effect built in that's more than just the buildup of the low frequency as you get close. They're designed to do a lot more for off-axis rejection, things like that. So yeah, you're taking a lot more into account. For recording, you need to think about that only in terms of what I was talking about before. Like if you're in a bad sounding room, then you really want to pick up as little of the room as possible. So something like an SM7, which is hypercardioid, has a tighter front pattern, but then you've got to understand that with that tighter pattern up front, you also get this little spike out the back. So you are picking up stuff that's directly behind the mic more than you would with a regular cardioid. So all of that technology is the same because it's microphones, but the live stuff has definitely been tailored recently in ways that the studio stuff that has not.
Another question asked about reference material, and I assume they're talking about when you're listening to your speakers. Do you use reference tracks to before you start mixing?
I don't, but this is a different thing. This is like what I was talking about before, where records are allowed to sound different. Like that's the thing, but spots on your station don't. And obviously the processing that your station has will help to homogenize it a bit, but you've got to be in the ballpark on your way in. But the thing about reference tracks is your brain does a gigantic amount of adjustment as you listen. So if you're going to use reference tracks, you need to listen to your project, then you need to stop and listen to nothing for 30 seconds, a minute, then switch over to your reference and listen again. Now, the problem there is that the brain's short-term memory for audio is terrible. But what you're really looking for isn't how much 10K do I have compared to that other thing. What you're looking for is the reference I'm listening to is really compelling and mine is not when I go back to it. And to be able to really A/B like that, you've got to take time in between. You can't just be switching back and forth quickly. That doesn't work.
Yeah, that kind of lends to the credence of you got to let your ears breathe every once in a while. It's easy to get wrapped up into something and listen, but take that break, go do an email or go get a cup of coffee or iced tea, and then come back and you it's like those things will pop out, good, bad, or indifferent.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about one of the tools that's in your toolbox, both in your situation, Andrew, and in the radio station, and that's equalization, or EQ as we call it. That's probably one of the best tools that you have, but it also can be one of the most dangerous tools if you're not familiar with it and how to use it. I was actually in a radio station one time, and the engineer wanted me to come in his production room and look at his new console. He said, "You got to see this." So I walked in there, and it was a nice console, a pro type console, and it had EQs up there. And I said, "Oh, this is pretty good." I said, did you have somebody explain to the people that are using it how to use those EQ knobs?" He said, "No, we told them never touch those things. Don't touch the." I said, "Oh, really?" So Andrew, talk a little bit about EQ and how that fits into your work, and how not to paint yourself in a corner with it.
Well, I mean, the more that I engineer, the less I do. I will very often record things now by sticking up the right microphone in the right place and do zero processing on the way in. Mixing, obviously, you're doing a little more because you've got to combine lots of sources and get them all to come out in one stereo feed. But basically, they're two types of EQ. And the easy way to think about it is you've got the boosting EQ and the cutting EQ. But the concept behind it is you've got EQ that is fixing problems. So if you've got low end boom on something, you can use a high pass filter or a low shelf to get rid of that. So taking frequencies away that are not what you want to hear is a better place to start than just cranking up the frequencies you think you want to hear. They technically do the same thing at the end of the day, but it's better to sort of focus on something that might be completely broken and be getting in the way and contain that a little bit. Then later on, the way I use EQ is I don't listen to a single source and say, oh, now I want to make that sound incredible, because it doesn't matter what it sounds like on its own. It only matters how it sounds in context. And so let's say you're just working with a voice and a background music bed. There are going to be things in the mid-range in that music that are probably going to fight with the vocal, because that's just the way it works. And you've got two choices. One would be to try and just keep boosting the vocal, more mid-range, or you could go into the music track and actually duck a little mid-range out. And I mean, if you want to get technical, there's also MS processing, so mid-side processing. If you're doing a true stereo thing, the voice is going to be dead center, and you want to kind of push the music out to the sides. And if you do MS processing, you can EQ some mid-range just out of the middle of the music. And that way it will still sound completely full frequency response, because wherever you hear it, where there isn't voice, it has everything. But in the middle, where it might be fighting with the vocal or with the voiceover, you've taken care of that. So I treat EQ when I'm adding almost like faders. I want to turn the thing up, but I do it by only turning up the bit of it that I want to hear, not by turning all of it up. Because then when you do that, you've just raised thing at frequencies that could be fighting with something else, and you end up in this endless game chasing your tail, trying to make sure you can hear everything. So EQ is a great tool, but you've got to be aware of why you're EQing something.
Sure, sure. One of the other things that we have now in digital audio workstations is the ability to do, like you call it, parallel processing. If you lay down a track, a voice track, and you need to put some sort of an effect on that, either the entire track or maybe just on a phrase. It may be a phrase that says, big sale starts tomorrow or starts today, and they want to get maybe some echo or something on that. And you might talk a little bit about parallel processing, but I see that as a way that you can duplicate that track and put the effects on that and then blend it in from that.
Yeah, I mean, the traditional way, especially if you're coming from the analog world, is you would have a send on the track that has that audio, and that send would go off to the effect, and then the effect would come back on a different fader, and then you would blend the two. But I actually find myself doing what you're talking about, rather than using a send where you can't actually see where you're using the effect and where you aren't. I make a copy of the track and put the effect directly on that copy. And that way you can just mute all the audio that's not supposed to get the effect. And you can use fade ins and fade outs and volume on that track, where you can actually see, oh, I'm coming in slowly for that echo, and that's why I'm not really hearing it at the beginning. You can change your edit, as opposed to having to look at automation on a send, which can sometimes be difficult to see with the waveform. It's much harder to edit than audio is usually in a DAW. So yeah, I do that all the time.
Yeah, somebody, I heard somebody talk about that one time, about somebody asked a question in the audience that said, how do you know when you got too much reverb or too much effect? And the answer for whoever was doing the presentation said, if you hear it, it's too much. You want to use the effects, except for maybe a certain type of effect on a part of a song, but normally you're using that just to build the entire image of the song.
Yeah. Yeah, that, I mean, certainly with vocals on the records I mix, you would think that a lot of them are very dry and don't have anything going on. But if you muted all the effects I had on them, they would just disappear completely. And those effects will change as you go from section to section of the song as well.
And Frank, you can join in on this. The listening habits have changed over the years. And I saw a graph the other day where over the air listening and streaming are almost neck and neck now. Streaming is catching up. And I know, Andrew, you actually talked about this when you spoke at the Google seminar you did out in California, I think, about all the different streaming services. And when you set up an Omnia processor, Frank, I assume in the back of your mind, or maybe at the top of the page, the processing you do is not destroying any of the sonic work that maybe Andrew has done in putting the song together. You're just doing something to make it appear sound better on the air. Is that correct?
Well, especially for, since you mentioned streaming, and we've done a lot of work with streaming. The whole streaming world is altogether different than over the air, because you don't get that moment to moment button punch, one station to another. In this case, one stream to another. You've got buffering and other things involved. The critical thing about signal processing for streaming is two. One, yes, you want to create that signature sound, but the other part, and this is a little different, is that we want to make sure that we're maximizing the efficiency of the audio codec, because, especially at lower bit rates, you're going to give up something. And, we have algorithms that are designed to minimize the effect of coding artifacts and things of that nature. Since there's a lot of spoken word in streaming, we want to enhance intelligibility, things of that nature. We want to minimize things that could be annoying in the background. I know there's a lot of times if I'm listening to like sports on some satellite services or streaming services, just the play by play, it's annoying to me because I'm hearing too many artifacts. And I can almost tell if they're using our gear or not, because for the same bit rate, it's like, oh, seems to sound okay, because we have found ways to psychoacoustically mask over the things that the ear would pick up and lock into and be annoyed with. So, the day of processing to have it, hammered to the wall like we do on, the heyday of AM or FM, that's not what we're dealing with in the streaming world. Over the air, I mean, processing, it's still processing. You get, no matter how many times people say, we want to sound great, and knock on wood, we've been very fortunate to make tens of thousands of radio stations sound great. At the end of the day, the PD still goes, I want to be another dB louder, and then you want to throw your hands up in the air. So that's the short form.
Yeah, I know, Andrew, you've had you don't really, when you're mixing, you don't really think about that this is probably going to be streamed at some time or another. You just produce it the best quality you can.
Absolutely, because there are two reasons. One is that it's a moving goalpost. I mean, Spotify can decide everything's going to be at a different bit rate and a different level tomorrow, and they're not going to tell you, and you don't get to go redo your mixes. So there's no point in mixing for formats that change. It's not like vinyl, which there's one way to cut vinyl and that's it. So, but the other thing is, if it sounds good, if in an empirical sense, whatever that is, it doesn't matter what your taste is, but if it's mixed well, it will sound good everywhere and it will survive every codec. And that's evidenced by, if you listen to a streaming music service on your laptop speakers, lots of stuff really doesn't sound very good because those laptop speakers don't sound good. But every once in a while, something will come on that will sound incredible no matter what you're listening on. And that just proves that will work. And it wouldn't be something that doesn't sound good anywhere. I defy anybody to find a sound system that Back in Black doesn't sound good on. It just does. It sounds good absolutely everywhere. You can't destroy it.
Speaking of streaming, when processing is involved, and we just did some testing just this past week because we've got some new product coming out. If there's multiband processing employed with streaming, one of the things that streaming doesn't like from the processing, I'm separating the work that, let's say, Andrew would be doing in the studio. This has to do with the processing system. If the processor is set up where there's intermod involved from the processing, it will annoy the codec. And that's one of the reasons why we work hard to see to it that our algorithms can create the effect you're looking for, but we try to minimize the sonic effects of intermod distortion. I'm not talking from clipping. I'm talking about stuff that's too busy, time constants that are a little out of control. Codecs, even at higher bit rates, they don't like that. And while I realize that some material might be produced in the studio to have an effect, we want to make sure that whatever's coming in, that same effect is carried through going out.
Yeah, and I just saw a question pop up on the chat page here, and that's what we were talking about they wanted to ask you, Andrew, that so many people are listening now on their iPhones and iPods, and they also we found out the other day, or I found out the other day, that the smart speakers are mono. I don't guess, as far as I know, nobody makes a stereo smart speaker, and they're actually in mono. So I guess
There are a few, like the bigger Sonos ones. If you run it on its own, it's got dual tweeters and will do a little
Right.
bit of stereo above certain frequencies. So some of them do, but yeah, in general, they're mono.
And there's another thing going on too, and this is something that at some point, Andrew, I'm going to reach out to you privately with regard to headphones, is that on some of these mono speakers, they're applying some tricks in the playback to create like a multi-dimensional effect. They try to take advantage of something called the HRTF, the head related transfer function, with the idea of, even though it's mono, when you're listening to it, it sounds like it's multi-dimensional. And that's, I think, a couple of these smart speakers, that's the little trick they're playing.
And the reason we bring that up with the smart speakers, some of them are being in mono. I would think it'd be very important that you check to make sure the phasing is right on everything, because that would completely destroy it if you've got something that's got a phase problem.
Yep.
Yeah, but sometimes that's all right. I'm a big fan of stereo spreaders. Yeah, I mean, I break things like that all the time, and I actually like it. But I just figure if someone's listening in mono, so much has changed that that's going to be the least of my worries.
So it doesn't, when you're in there mixing, you don't even think about.
I don't, but you need to, and I used to, but now I really don't care. Yeah. I mean, and I know I'm not creating problems. I would notice them. Like, it would feel phasey to me, and I would recognize that while I'm working. So there's no way something's going out the door where when it goes in mono, the drums disappear. It won't happen.
There's something else to think about too, Larry, is that, remember, while a lot of production is done in stereo, mono to all of us is really a phantom, what we call a phantom center. And if if what's in the center sounds wrong, then you realize you got some other work to do. So if even if you're not putting up like some XY pattern somewhere to look at the phase, the phantom center would be out of kilter.
And going back to one of your earlier questions, that is the job of a well set up monitor system. This is where headphones won't help you out. You do need to be on speakers. You've got to be able to sit in the middle and have that listening position that you can trust, because phase problems will raise their hand very high immediately. They're not subtle.
That's exactly right. One of the things that we heard the other day, that even through processors, when you use plugins in your system, sometimes there is some artifacts and phase delay that happens in some of the plugins, and that will create a comb filtering and stuff that way. So you have to be careful with that too.
Yeah, any equalizer or filter, unless it is built to be linear phase, isn't. And if it's a plugin that doesn't have a ton of latency, then it isn't, because that's a very difficult thing to do in the digital domain fast. So yeah, any EQ, any crossover, any multiband compressor, anything like that will have phase issues when run in parallel.
I think you actually have, I don't know if that's the unit behind you back there, but you have a Neve, I think, that was actually set up for quadraphonic. Is that correct?
Yeah, I have, unfortunately, due to studios closing and things like that, I've actually sold that last year. That's a pandemic casualty. But yes, for many years, I owned a Neve 8068 that was set up for quad.
Well, one of the things that I hear quite often in television stations, where they're now running not just 4-channel, but they're running 5.1 or 7.1, and I don't know if you get involved in that or not, but when they mix that down to somebody that's listening on just a stereo, they don't have the 5.1 surround sound. Sometimes that can really get a little screwy. I don't, do you get involved in that?
Yeah, I've done a bit, and I'm actually about halfway through setting my room up for mixing in Atmos. So I'm gonna have 16 more speakers in here pretty soon, which is a little frightening. Um, but yes, and one of the things that makes me want to work in Atmos is they are spending a gigantic amount of time on the binaural representation of the multi-channel sound. So you don't have to do completely separate mixes between your 5.1 and your stereo, which really you do if you're doing traditional 5.1 mixing. You can't just fold it down and hope it's going to work, because things will get weird. So and that's where it's this whole going back to people listening on your earbuds and stuff like that. Everybody's wearing headphones. So if you can get a good binaural representation of multi-speaker sound, that's the holy grail. Definitely.
Yeah, I ran across that a while back when I was watching a program on television and the dialogue was going, and then they had some underlying background music playing, but it actually overpowered the dialogue. And I talked to somebody over at the TV station about that. They said, yeah, it's the way that they're folding down the 5.1. They're not, it's not set up right or something, but that's really could be a problem.
Yeah.
Well, to that effect, Larry, there is a standard by which for the HDTV system, you're supposed to have things set a certain way so that for people listening in stereo or mono, that you get the proper down mix. And if not, you're right, things go foobar really quick. I have a
Yeah.
5.1 set up in my living room, and there's times I just shake my head based on some of the things, even that come out in 5.1. I'm like, excuse my language, but what the hell were they doing? Or, somebody doesn't know, somebody's got something wrong in Denmark somewhere. And it's
Well, and some of this comes from all the weird new loudness standards, the LUFS,
Yep.
which is the long-term loudness measurement.
Oh,
You can trick it. And that's why if you watch movies now, you will never hear anything in a quiet scene. You'll never be able to hear it, because by making the quiet stuff quieter, they can make the loud stuff louder.
right.
And the overall loudness rating of the hour-and-a-half long movie doesn't go above what it's supposed to go above. So all of that stuff can be tricked. And it's, I would argue, in a way, it's made things worse.
I agree. As a matter of fact, one of the things I'm toying with doing is developing some little app, and then try to go to, not to the end user, but to the, let's say the people that put the set-top boxes, or the people that make the televisions, such that you could set it so that you've got like a consistent, not smashed, but a nice, consistent, normalized level. Because a perfect example, when I'm watching the previews on Netflix, they're blaringly loud. You select that program, you turn it on, I'm running the volume up and down, up and down. And my girlfriend's like, what the hell's wrong with you? I'm like, I can't hear the thing half the time, and it's because of this long-term loudness thing. It's crazy.
And like you say, Andrew, that's a changing thing. I think every day that's being changed a little bit.
Yeah.
The other thing, finally, I wanted to ask you about your moving over from analog, which you used for years, and now you're totally in the box, as they call it.
Mhm.
Was there one driving reason why you went that direction?
No, there were a lot. And the other thing is, I old enough that I learned on analog, but then I'm a geek and I adopted digital very, very early. And I actually mixed in the box before I could afford a console. So, but then I had analog Mackie boards and digital Mackie boards, and then I worked completely in the box. And then I came back out onto this huge Neve and have become the poster child for analog mixing. But I've been back fully digital for 10 years or more now. The reason was because of the economics of the record industry. To be completely honest, you can't afford to tie up a whole studio working on one song, because people don't get back to you fast enough. You've got to work on multiple projects at the same time. And in the analog domain, it doesn't matter how meticulous you are writing down where every single knob in the studio is, no mix will ever come back the same when you put those 1,500 knobs back where you thought they were. So it was really untenable. I couldn't work. But now that I've made the transition, I absolutely love it. And I would never go back. Some people will ask, like, if you had the budget and the time, would you do a record mixing analog? And the answer is no, I wouldn't.
So I see where recallability is a real big help in using a DAW.
Yeah. And also the flexibility, like now I can work on more than one song at a time, but I make sure that I do. When I mix a record, let's say it's 12 songs, I mix all 12 at the same time. And I'll work on all 12 each day. And one of them might be for an hour and a half because I'm really getting stuff done, or 4 hours. And one of them I might open up and 30 seconds later say, I'm not ready to work on this song, and just close it. And instead of being stuck, not feeling creative, I can always be ready to do what it is I'm going to do.
Sure. One final thing here we'll talk about, and Al, I'll get your input along with the rest of them, is in the olden days when you recorded something in a production room and you sent it over to the playout system, the automation system, all that you kept was a stereo version. But now with the ability to save, it's really, I would think, important to save that project in multi-track form. For instance, you may have a client call back the day after it goes on the air or the next week and say, can you go in and change that one sentence where it talked about the price or when the sale ends? And if all you saved was the stereo version, you got to go back in and redo the whole thing. So is that the way do you save it in multi-track form, Al?
Yes, always. I try to keep everything. Now that's a great advantage of the times we live in. You can just keep buying more external hard drive because you never know when you're going to need to open that session back up. I mean, it's probably more common than not to have to make a music bed change or to make some word change like you referenced. So yeah, you sure don't want to go back and reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, and that's different from stems. Real quickly, Andrew, what is the difference in saving in multi-track and saving stems?
Well, I mean, the terminology has gotten really messed up in the last few years, but the actual way that I know of it is the multi-track is the original recordings that you've made that make up the thing that you've made. Stems are printing a mix one element at a time. So it's processed, automated, all the effects. However you had it going in the mix, you're now printing a version of the mix that has only that one element, and you go through and do all of the elements separately. The problem is with shared dynamics processing or anything like that, those stems don't add up 100% to the actual mix. But what's good about them is you can play them back without any particular software. You just have a bunch of WAV files. You could put them in any DAW, hit play, and you'll be close to the original mix. But the downside is you cannot change things the way you can if you save the multi-track project.
Right. Anybody else have any comments? I really appreciate all of you joining us, Frank and Andrew, especially having you with us and sharing the information. And I hope this has been helpful to all the production people out there, because I think using a DAW is really the way to go now. I don't know that any radio station has a reel-to-reel machine, or they threw away their splicing block and they're all using DAWs, and you can do tremendous things with a DAW. But you really got to sit down and learn what all the features, because like I said earlier, if you do them wrong, you'll make fundamental mistakes. And at the end of the day, at the end of the project, it sounds terrible. So you really need to get a handle on how all the different features work. So Andrew, we thank you for joining us over there from London, and Frank up there somewhere around Cincinnati, and Al up in Nashville, Music City. So
Thank you, Larry.
all three of you. Thank you.
All right, thanks for having us.
Okay, John, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about next month's meeting.
All right. Thank you, Larry. And what a great presentation today. Next month, we're going to have fun, and we're going to deal a little with the RF side. I know drones have been very popular, and we all try to play with a drone from time to time. But an engineer up in Boston, Paul Schulings is his name, is taking it probably further than most people have. He has spent a lot of time and money and equipment and training, and has set up a drone service that can look at infrared so that you can actually fly your transmission line, fly the tower, the antenna, and look for hot spots. And he's going to give us details, examples, and exactly what is involved, including the different types of materials that are used in transmission line and how that is affected. So it will be a fun hour for everybody. And again, that'll be a month from now, 10 a.m. Central Time with Paul Schulings. Larry?
Yeah, that'll be on the 20th, I believe, here. 20th of April, I believe it is.
I believe
So,
that is correct.
yeah,
Yes.
that's correct. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we hope to see you next month for the ABA Engineering Academy's engineering webinar. Thanks, everyone.